Hey, Scott, you know what would be really helpful? Would you summarize, and I know there's a lot of
Yeah.
wonderful things in the book, Ultra Learning, which I really
Mhm.
encourage folks to pick up, but would you summarize some basic advice for anyone who wants to learn to
So I'll try to go over very briefly some of the core principles. So the first core principle I talk about is meta learning, which is that if you're going to embark in a self-education project, you have to understand how the skill works that you're trying to learn or topic you're trying to learn. And the best way to do that is to ask other people that have learned it, to research online what is the right way to learn this skill. Figure out what the status quo is. I mean, I think I'm talking about diversity, but you have to know what the way people typically learn it to have any opinion about what is a different way to learn it. Most ways are not effective. So better to start with something that does eventually get results and then work upon that as your default than to just start with something that might be completely fallacious and not actually work. I talk about focus in the book. Focus is so important. A lot of people have this idea that you can learn effectively while doing other things, while multitasking. And there's incredible research that shows that no, that's not true. If you're trying to learn anything complicated, anything that requires any amount of thought, attention, focus is required. And so the student who has the television blaring on in the background, or the person who's I'm just going to like have this on in the background while I'm doing something else, your attention isn't focused on it, you're probably not going to be learning it. And this conversely means that the people who are able to devote chunks of time to the things they want to learn are often the people that get ahead. And I know that this is difficult. I have a young baby at home, and I have a full-time job, and I run a business that has staff and things. I know how difficult it is to put time, but I also think that we put in time for the things that we really care about. And so very often it's not a problem of how do we have enough time to do this, but how do I make the costs of engaging in it low enough? And how do I make the excitement and enthusiasm for engaging it high enough? Then you'll be able to put in the time. And the problem is that cost benefit balance is often out of whack for a lot of us in the things that we're pursuing. I talk about directness, the thing that we've been talking about before, where you need to do direct practice in the thing that you're trying to get good at, and that there is enormous research showing that skills we learn are surprisingly narrow, and that things don't transfer as well as we'd like from one domain to another. This is disappointing, but it seems to point to some deeper principles of how the brain works, of how neuroscience works. So I don't think it's something that is just explainable by, well, if we just found the right way to teach people, we would be able to teach them something that's super generalizable to every single possible situation. Just doesn't seem to be how the brain works. But the converse of that is that if you really want to get good at something, honing in on that direct practice is very beneficial. And very often it can give you sort of very impressive seeming benefits, because most people don't do that. So languages are my favorite example. Most people shy away from trying to communicate with the language in the beginning. The people who do, people actually use it to converse, very often get to a level where they can have functional conversations much, much earlier than people who take the kind of slow plodding classroom
it's
approach.
because people probably just don't want the discomfort, the embarrassment, the judgment of jumping in and being inadequate.
Emotions are a big part of it, for sure. Emotions are a big part of it. One of the chapters I talk about is feedback, and the research on feedback shows that, well, feedback is very helpful, but often when you get negative feedback, if you don't process it correctly, if you take it as sort of a threat to your well-being, to who you are, then it can serve as a demotivator. Alternatively, also praise, turns out, is actually bad. If you're a teacher and you're giving students just praise, in the sense of not giving them something useful, but just, you're so smart, oh, you're so good at this, that actually also has a demotivating effect.
Right.
So it's not just negative feedback, it's also overly positive feedback, or a non-specific positive feedback that doesn't encourage you to do anything differently, can often also be negative. And so the role of feedback is very important. I think self-education and self-directed learning projects often can take advantage of feedback that wouldn't work in a classroom, because most of the students who are in the classroom are just they're there to just show up and get a grade. And so if you were to do sort of an extreme throw you in the deep end approach in the classroom, maybe students would rebel, but you can do that for yourself. So a lot of the things that I talk about in ultra learning, I think, are kind of an exception to this rule, that if you are in this environment, something that would be punitive if you were kind of forced to do it might be as challenging and exciting if you are sort of taking it upon yourself. The Year Without English was a project that we devised, that we decided that we were going to set this rule for ourselves. It wasn't something that someone else told us to do. And I think that was part of the reason that it was kind of an exciting challenge, and not like this is just a nightmare torture session for 1 year. Similarly with the MIT challenge, like I was studying every day, but I loved it because this was something that I was eager to do, to try something different. It wasn't, you know, if I don't do this, my parents are I'm going to fail out of school and I'm going to waste my tuition dollars and all the sort of negative performance evaluations that people often experience in school. It was just a total flip of that affect. So I think that ultra learning projects very often can be some of the most engaging and peak experiences of our lives, not the way that we often think of school, where they're often these sort of punitive, I have to do this and I'm failing right now. And
you mentioned peak experience, which reminded me of the book, Anders Ericsson's book, Peak, which is also a wonderful book. And he studies mastery and how people have gotten great at things. What he basically says in the book is that, which I believe, is that nobody's born a master, and everybody learns through trial and getting good feedback and rapid feedback and persistence. And, you know, that's where the 10,000 hour rules kind of came from, although that's not quite what he's talking about. It's not just 10,000 hours of doing something. It's 10,000 hours of doing something with deliberate practice, you know, getting feedback and improvement. Here's my question for you. Having gone through all these different learning experiences, do you also feel that anything is learnable? Anything is, that mastery is attainable pretty much by anyone in any area, provided there's interest and there's deliberate practice?
So this is a super interesting question, because I find that we tend to very easily conflate two different things. One of them is, can you learn to do X? And I think this is the point of Ericsson, and I think this is what I would sort of emphasize in my own philosophy toward it, is that there's sort of ample evidence that our brains are kind of sufficiently plastic that, aside from some extreme cases of particular kind of very specific cognitive or sort of brain damage or neurological deficits, for instance, people who have amnesia or things like this, most people can learn, I would say, anything. That there's not the case that, oh, there's just some people who can't learn another language. That's nonsense. There's cultures where everyone learns multiple languages. So it's certainly not the case that human hardwiring is the case that there's just a huge swath of people that can't learn languages, or there's people who can't draw. No, also nonsense. The problem might be that you don't want to draw enough, and that's fine. I mean, there's certain skills in my life that maybe I won't learn just because they're never going to be a priority for me, or, you know, I just have interests in other things. I'm never going to become a race car driver. I'm just not as interested in it. It's not something that's my passion. That's fine. But that's different from saying I couldn't become a race car driver if I wanted to. The other thing I want to distinguish is the notion between learning something absolutely or objectively and learning something in competition or in relative contrast to other people. Because when we talk about mastery, we're kind of mixing those two ideas together, meaning just being able to perform a skill to some absolute benchmark versus being able to perform a skill that you're the best at compared to another group of people that are also trying to learn the skill. And so in these cases, when we're talking about, can anyone become, let's say, world class? Well, then it depends on, well, who are your competitors for becoming world class? And so I do disagree more with Ericsson in the idea that talent or natural abilities, he kind of discounts them a little bit too heavily, I think. I think that there is ample evidence that, you know, some people maybe are better suited to being artists or polyglots or athletes or mathematicians than other people. But that doesn't mean that it's because they're the only people who can learn that, or only people can learn it to some benchmark, but just because maybe it's a little bit easier for them. And when you're dealing with the top 0.01% of any field, everyone's going to be super, super motivated. They're all going to be obsessively performing. And so naturally, the people who do it slightly better are going to end up being better in the long run. But I think when we're talking about, you know, doing something where you want to be adequate at it, doing something where you want to be good enough that you can get paid for it, doing something where you want to do it where you love doing it, I think the world is pretty much an open market. You can learn almost anything that you want to. And so I lean on optimism, but I think it's important to understand that nuance, because I think there is also the idea that people have that, well, if I am learning something a bit slower than other people, then I must be making a mistake, that it's my fault, that if like, and that's not true either. It's certainly the case that some people will learn something a little bit faster. Lots of times people have different prior experiences that make it much easier for them to learn something. When I was on my trip, I was meeting some people who were Italians who were also doing kind of what we were doing and learning Spanish. And this was about, 3 weeks in, and I was like, wow, their Spanish is so good. It must just be those Europeans are so good at learning languages. And it was only later that I realized, well, Italian is so similar to Spanish. They have an enormous leg up on me learning it.
Right.
And similarly, someone who is, let's say, Chinese learning a European language for the first time would be much slower than I was at learning Spanish. And it has nothing to do with his strategy.
Right.
But I think the idea here is that if you want to learn something and you care about it, that you can, and that there is a process for doing that. And so understanding that process, I think, is important regardless of whether you're going to become the top person in the world or whether this is just going to become a fun hobby for you.
You felt there were improvements beyond the skills and abilities that you've learned? In other words, sort of a meta question, but in other words, did you feel the experiences you went through, did they impact, do you feel they changed your cognitive skills? Do you feel it made you able to learn faster? Did it impact how you view the world? Did it impact how you view yourself?
So I think the main thing that I've gained from doing a lot of these projects is that I've learned a kind of a deeper sort of model of how to approach learning something that is much more explicit for me than it would be for other people. And so I feel like I can, from having done, and again, this is the benefit of having done many of these projects, I can kind of spot mistakes before I have to make them. So I'll give a little example of this, and I'm not in any way a competent salsa dancer, but about a year ago, this is pre-COVID, I was doing salsa dancing with my wife, and we were, just doing it for fun. And we were going to the lessons where they teach you sort of like some moves, like, okay, this is how you do a spin and then a double spin or something. And they would teach us move, and you would practice it with a few people and back and forth. And we were doing this for a month or two, and we were like, let's go to one of these social dancing. And the social dancing is where you dance with people and they're not telling you choreography, you just dance. There's just music playing and you just dance. And we found it, especially I did as the lead, found it very difficult to do that. It was like, well, I was able to do all these things in the classroom. Why am I not able to do it in here? And it's because I have all this experience with like transfer and sort of thinking about how skills work and this kind of mental model of it, that it was very obvious to me, well, the problem is that in the classroom, they tell you which moves you're supposed to do. So you as the lead, for instance, your partner knows what you're trying to do. So they kind of do it for you. Whereas in a dancing situation, the whole difficulty of it is you have to communicate what you want your partner to do sort of as you're also doing it and remembering it. And so this is one of the things that was cueing into me that, well, if I were sort of dealing with this as a student and I don't have this theory of transfer and this theory of how skills work and maybe what are some of the like cognitive processes that are breaking down that are making this harder, I might just come up with the idea of like, oh, I'm just not good at this, or I just need to do even more lessons, like that's my problem, that I just didn't master them enough in the lessons, or I might draw the wrong inference from what I'm experiencing. And so I think doing a lot of these projects has given me that kind of meta understanding of how learning works in a lot of cases, so that I can approach a new skill and sort of break it down into, well, this is what would have to happen for me to get good at this. These are the things that I have to watch for. When I experience certain kinds of feedback, I can notice it. And I think that there is a sort of meta learning there that I don't think it's the case that it necessarily makes you 100 times smarter, but it allows you to sort of gravitate to correct approaches. So I think people who regularly take on these kinds of projects do eventually get this sort of second sense for, no, that's not the right way to do it, in a way that someone who maybe even they've learned a lot of things, but they've only ever been learning it in kind of a passive classroom instruction where they've never had to design their own learning approach before. They might not know how to learn a skill that they've never approached before.
Right. Reminds me of what Kevin Kelly said. He's a technology luminary.
Mm-hmm.
He said that, and the founder of Wired Magazine, he said that a major skill in the future is going to be learning how to learn. Mm-hmm. And that's something you've certainly taught yourself. I want to be respectful of your time. I have one final question. If there's anything that you'd like to provide to folks, if there's something I can send out, that'd be awesome.
Perfect. Well, I think we already spoke about getting some of your readers a little ebook that has some of these ideas summarized if they want to remember them, internalize them. As well, You can check out my website at scotthyung.com, SCOTTHYLUNG.com. I have over 1,400 articles written on all these subjects: learning, motivation, habits, goal setting, career development. And you can also check out the book UltraLearning. It's available Amazon, Audible, anywhere that you get your books. And I go through a lot more of these ideas and a lot more stories that we didn't have time to cover on how to learn hard skills.
Yeah, I'll put links and pictures and everything in there so people can see it. And by the way, I love all the illustrations and all your posts, which are all done by a guy you know well, you. But they're wonderful. I mean, they've got a little personality all their own. So all the illustrations you do. And just as a quick comment, I see the art on the wall, the still lifes. That's also you.
Yeah. Yes, it is. No, I definitely find that when you learn more and more skills, you find, I don't know, you find little opportunities in life that would have been hidden from before. And so my whole philosophy toward learning is just that as you learn more things, the world gets bigger and it becomes a more interesting and richly populated place. And so I think there's no greater motivation to learn things than to just have an expansion of the things that are possible for you and the things that you can experience in your life.
That is a wonderful sentiment and a wonderful insight. As you learn more things, the world gets bigger. Fantastic. I don't think we could end on a better note. Scott H. Young, thank you so much. It's really, really been a pleasure. And I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you.